Hi, this is Chris again from Nightfall Audiobooks, and this week I have for you The Dare by R.L. Stine from the Fear Street line. I've received a number of requests for this book, so I'm covering it. I haven't read it before, so I do what I usually do when I read through the first couple of chapters. This book is 31 chapters long, and I made note of some of the main characters and assigned voices as I saw fit, and I hope it turns out well. So let's begin. What should I do next? I don't know. And without your suggestions, I don't have any idea what I should be choosing next to do. So please write me an email, nightfallaudiobooks@gmail.com. I am also on YouTube at Nightfall Audiobooks. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And I have a Patreon page, patreon.com/nightfallaudiobooks. Any help would be greatly appreciated. So tell your friends, tell your mom, tell whoever you think would like to listen to me tell them tales from R.L. Stine. Thank you very much for listening, and let's begin. Welcome to a Nightfall Audiobooks production of The Dare by R.L. Stine, a Fear Street novel, Book 21. Prologue. Am I really doing this? The question repeated in my mind as I made my way across the backyard. The pistol in my hand felt hot, as if it were about to burst into flame. Am I really doing this? Do I really have a loaded pistol in my hand? Am I really going to use it? Joanna Wise, murderer. Is that how I will be known from now on? She was always a quiet girl, rather mousy. That's how the neighbors will describe me in the newspaper. She lived with her divorced mother. They didn't have much money. Joanna never seemed to have many friends, but she always had a nice smile for everyone. Who would ever guess? Who would ever guess that Joanna Wise was a murderer? Or maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm not creeping across the next yard to kill my teacher. I mean, would I really kill my teacher just because of a stupid dare? Maybe this is just another one of my fantasies. I have so many violent fantasies these days. I imagine so many frightening things. Maybe this is another fantasy. My stomach really hurts. This is the worst stomachache I've ever had. My hand is sweating. I'm really afraid. Am I really doing this? Yes, I am. I'm raising the pistol. I'm squeezing the trigger. Once I kill him, I'll feel so much better. Chapter 1. I guess it started weeks ago at the 7-Eleven, the one at the end of Mission Street, way past the mall. It was a little after 8 o'clock, a cold, clear night. I remember thinking the stars overhead looked a little like snowflakes. My best friend, Margaret Rivers, and I drove to the 7-Eleven and Margaret's little white Geo to get hot dogs. Believe it or not, that was my dinner. You see, Mom's been working 2 jobs ever since she and Dad got divorced. She works late every night. Sometimes I don't see her for days. I can't remember the last time the 2 of us sat down to have dinner together. So Margaret and I were at the front counter ordering hot dogs. I was starving. Everyone thinks I don't eat much because I'm so skinny, but that just isn't true. Margaret and I don't look like we have a thing in common, but maybe that's why we're such good friends. I'm short and very thin. I've got long, straight black hair, my best feature, and dark brown eyes. My nose is too pointy, and I hate the cleft in my chin, but that's another story. Margaret is nearly a head taller than I am and kind of chunky. She's still trying to lose her baby fat, that's what she always says. She has curly, carrot-colored hair and a face full of freckles. She isn't very pretty, but she's a great friend and she can always make me laugh. This winter, after my parents' divorce and all, I really needed a friend who could make me laugh. I've always had a tendency to look on the dark side. You know how people can see a glass of water and some will say it's half full and someone else will say it's half empty? Well, I'm kind of the person who will say the glass is half empty and cracked, and who cares about a stupid glass of water anyway? I get depressed a lot, I admit it. That's why it's so great to have a close friend like Margaret Rivers. Margaret and I may not have the coolest clothes or drive the best cars. We're both totally broke most of the time, but we manage to have fun sometimes, even in a little town like Shadyside. We're out of mustard, the sales clerk at the 7-Eleven said, holding our 2 hot dogs out to me over the counter. He was a middle-aged man, balding in front, his stomach bulging under his green knit shirt. Then I guess we'll have them plain, I told him. I guess, he muttered. He handed over the 2 hot dogs, then threw 2 more raw dogs on the machine. Hey, Joanna, look! Margaret held her hot dog in one hand. She nudged me with the other. I followed her gaze to the back of the store. I heard laughing and loud voices, and then I saw a bunch of kids I recognized. What are they doing here? I whispered to Margaret. There were 5 kids back there around the slurping machine. I didn't know any of them very well. They're seniors and Margaret and I are juniors. but I recognized them right away because Margaret and I have been taking some senior classes. They were just about the wealthiest kids at Shadyside High. I was sure all 5 of them lived in North Hills, the ritziest part of town. You know, enormous houses, well-kept lawns, tall hedges to keep riffraff like Margaret and me from getting too close. They were laughing a lot and shoving one another, knocking the Slurpee cups on the floor. You know, just goofing on each other, having fun. I saw Dennis Arthur and his girlfriend Caitlin Monroe. I like Dennis. We're in advanced math together, and he let me copy from his paper during a test once. He's a pretty good guy, and really great looking. He's got short black hair and green eyes. He's the star of the Shadyside track team, and he really looks like an athlete. A girl named Melody Dawson was there, too. She's a real stuck-up snob. She was kidding around with Lanny Barnes and Zach Hamilton. Zach is a big guy, built like a wrestler. He has curly red hair and wears bright blue sunglasses day and night. He was bragging in class about how he's related to one of the founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton. Maybe it's true. I don't know. And do I care? No. I took a big bite of my hot dog. It was cold. Margaret and I watched the 5 kids, trying to look like we weren't watching them. I dare you, I heard one of them say. I think it was Lanny. I double dare you, one of them shot back. Dennis started to pour some of the purple Slurpee stuff into a cup, and Lanny punched the cup out of his hand. The purple slush poured onto Dennis's white sneakers. Hey! Dennis playfully punched Lanny on the shoulder. Then Lanny poured a big glob of slush into his hand and shook hands with Dennis. Margaret and I had to laugh. I mean, it was really funny. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw that the store clerk had an angry scowl on his face. He was getting really steamed. The Slurpee fight was getting a little wild. Caitlin and Melody were splashing cups of purple slush at each other. A big glob fell onto Melody's head and trickled down her perfect blonde hair. Dennis started laughing, a high-pitched hyena laugh. But he stopped when Zach and Lanny both dumped cups of their purple stuff down the front of his maroon and gray Shadyside High jacket. The 5 kids were slipping and sliding now. The floor was covered with puddles of purple slush. Lanny went down. He hit the floor and slid onto his back. And then Zach sprawled on top of him. Dennis let out that high-pitched laugh again. Everyone was laughing. Margaret and me, too. It was such a riot. Stop it! Stop it right now! I'll call the cops! I really will! The clerk's angry shout made everyone stop laughing. I turned and saw that his face was nearly as purple as the Slurpee slush, and the veins were bulging at the sides of his neck. It looked like his head was going to explode. Really? At the back of the store, Lanny had climbed to his feet, but Zach was still sprawled on the floor. The Slurpee machine was running. The purple slush poured out in a thick stream onto the linoleum. Dennis tried to help Zach up, but Zach only pulled him to the floor, and everyone started laughing all over again. You kids think you can do whatever you like, the red-faced clerk was shrieking. He burst out from behind the counter, shaking his fist at them. Oh no, I thought, glancing wearily at Margaret. Is he going to fight them? This was getting intense. Margaret grabbed my arm. I don't think she even realized she was holding on to me. The store clerk lumbered over to the 5 kids, his stomach heaving as he walked. He was breathing really hard and still shaking his fist angrily. I'm calling the cops! I'm calling them right now! Dennis and Zach climbed to their feet. Melody and Caitlin suddenly had frightened looks on their faces. No, you're not, Dennis said quietly. Huh? What did you say? The clerk screamed furiously. I said you're not calling the cops, Dennis replied calmly. And then I saw the gun in Dennis's hand. Margaret must have seen it too, because her grip tightened on my arm. I didn't have time to cry out or anything. You're not calling anyone, Dennis told the clerk coldly. And then he pulled the trigger. Chapter 2. A stream of water sprayed from the gun. It splashed onto the front of the store clerk's green shirt. The kids all went bananas, laughing wildly and slapping each other high fives. Dennis, you're the man, Lanny cried gleefully. You're the man. The store clerk was so angry I thought I could see steam rising up from his bald head. Margaret and I were still huddled together in the front of the store. We were laughing pretty hard, too. There was a payphone against the back wall. The clerk angrily grabbed the receiver. He pulled it so hard I thought he was going to jerk the phone off the wall. I'm calling the cops, he said in an angry growl. But then Zach reached for his wallet. I saw him take some bills from it, and he stuffed them into the clerk's shirt pocket. This should pay for the Slurpees, he said, and the mess. And then the 5 kids paraded past us, big pleased grins on their faces, and headed out the glass door to the parking lot. Just because they're rich, they think they can get away with anything, the store clerk muttered. He was looking down at the big puddles of purple slush. Is he talking to us or to himself? Margaret whispered. I shrugged. They went by so fast, I wasn't sure if the Shadyside kids had seen Margaret and me, but I glanced out the front window and caught Dennis Arthur staring in at me. That's weird, I thought, feeling my face grow hot. Why is he staring at me with that weird grin on his face? I was trying to decide whether to wave to him or not, but before I could decide, his girlfriend Caitlin pulled him away. Mr. Northwood, my history teacher, is tall and very lean. He kind of stoops his head and his shoulders all the time, as if he doesn't really want to be as tall as he is. He has thick, wavy hair. I think it used to be brown, but now it's mostly gray. He has watery blue eyes and a craggy face, with lots of deep lines running down his cheeks. He sort of looks like a beardless Abe Lincoln or maybe Clint Eastwood on a really bad day. He's a weird guy. For one thing, he always wears turtlenecks. Never any other kind of shirt or sweater. It's not the most flattering style for him, because he has a big, bulging Adam's apple that always bobs up and down right where the turtleneck ends. Another weird thing about Mr. Northwood is that he tape records everything. Really, everything. He has this little silvery mini recorder that he carries in his pocket. When class begins, he sets the recorder on the desk and clicks it on. When he's ready to dismiss the class, he clicks off the recorder, removes the tiny cassette, and slips it back into his pocket. Weird, huh? The other weird thing about having Mr. Northwood as a teacher is that he's also my next-door neighbor, on Fear Street. But let's not get into that now. The afternoon after the 7-Eleven incident, I was sitting near the back of my history class, half listening to Mr. Northwood, half daydreaming. I kept glancing at the clock above Mr. Northwood's head. The school day was almost over. Outside the windows, the sky was gray and growing darker. I wondered if it was cold enough to snow. I hoped not. I remembered that I had lost my red wool gloves somewhere, and I didn't have any money to buy another pair. When Mr. Northwood clicked off his little tape recorder and slid it into his pocket, I sat up straight and began shoving my trapper keeper into my backpack. "Dismissed," Mr. Northwood said in his reedy, thin voice. I jumped to my feet, straightening the bottom of my white cotton sweater, pulling it down over my faded denims. I left my backpack on the floor, told Margaret I'd meet her in the hall, and started to the front of the room. I had to ask Mr. Northwood a question about the paper I was writing about Charles Lindbergh. I didn't know if he wanted me to just write about Lindbergh's career, or did I have to write about the kidnapping of his baby too? I had started to the front when I saw that Dennis Arthur had gotten there first. Mr. Northwood said something to him, and Dennis reacted angrily. I stopped short as I started to argue. The room had emptied out. I took a step back, then another, lingering against the wall. "I told you why I can't take the midterm exam," Dennis cried shrilly. He was gesturing excitedly with his hands. Even from the back of the room, I could see his green eyes flash excitedly. I could tell Dennis was really upset. "My family always goes to the Bahamas in February," Dennis said, crossing his arms in front of his navy blue sweatshirt. "What am I supposed to do, Mr. Northwood? Stay home so I can take your exam?" Mr. Northwood shook his head. The lines in his face seemed to grow deeper. "Have a good trip," he said dryly. "Send me a postcard, Dennis." "Well, I don't see why I can't give me a makeup test when I get back," Dennis insisted, leaning over the teacher's chair, challenging him. "Or give me a test I can take along with me." Mr. Northwood shook his head, his colorless lips forming the word no. "Why not?" Dennis demanded. "It would be unfair to your classmates," the teacher replied softly, stooping his head, as he gathered his books and papers together. I was starting to feel embarrassed listening to this. I mean, I didn't want Dennis to think I was deliberately eavesdropping or anything. But I don't think Dennis even knew I was in the room, and I really did want to ask Mr. Northwood my question. So I stayed, leaning against the wall, thinking about how great-looking Dennis is, imagining what it would be like to be Caitlin, his girlfriend, and listening as the argument grew really intense. "If I get an F, do you know what will happen to me?" Dennis cried. He didn't wait for Mr. Northwood to answer. "I'll lose my eligibility on the track team." "I feel bad about that," Mr. Northwood replied. As Dennis got louder, the teacher's voice became softer. "I really do, Dennis." "But all my other teachers are giving me a break," Dennis exclaimed. "They know I'm going to be all-state this year. They know I could get an Olympics tryout. I could be a national star, Mr. Northwood. I really could." "I hope so," Mr. Northwood replied, turning his head to glance up at the clock. "Great. Then give me a makeup test. Give me a break, okay?" Dennis pleaded, staring hard into the teacher's watery eyes. "In my opinion, you get too many breaks," the teacher replied quietly. He began shoving books into his worn leather briefcase. After a few moments, he stopped and raised his eyes to Dennis. "Give me one good reason why I should give you special treatment." "Because I asked you to," Dennis replied without hesitating. The room suddenly grew darker as the storm clouds lowered over the sky. One of the overhead fluorescent lights near the door buzzed and flickered. "Our discussion is over. I'm really sorry," Mr. Northwood told Dennis. He clicked his briefcase shut. Dennis just gaped at him. His mouth dropped open, but he didn't say anything. Then Dennis threw up his hands in a gesture of total exasperation. I don't believe this," Dennis screamed, losing his temper. Suddenly, I realized someone was calling my name. I turned to the door and saw Margaret motioning to me. As I made my way to Margaret, I could hear Dennis shouting furiously at Mr. Northwood. "Margaret, what is it?" I whispered, stepping into the doorway. And then I heard a loud thud. I heard Mr. Northwood let out a cry. A heavy feeling of dread shot through my body. Without looking, I knew that Dennis had slugged him. Chapter 3. My breath caught in my throat. I turned back to the front of the room. I was relieved to see that Dennis hadn't hit Mr. Northwood. He had angrily slammed a heavy textbook to the floor instead. Mr. Northwood had been calm and soft-spoken, but now he really lost his cool. He went all white and pointed a shaky finger at Dennis and started sputtering at him about respect for school property. Dennis looked totally stunned. I think he was really upset that he lost his temper like that. He was breathing hard, glaring at Mr. Northwood, balling and unballing his fists as the teacher laced into him. "What's going on?" Margaret whispered, peeking in timidly from the hall. "World War III, I whispered back, picking up my backpack and edging out of the room. "Who's winning?" Margaret asked as I joined her in the hall. "Mr. Northwood, I think," I replied, crossing the empty hall to my locker. I could hear Dennis and Mr. Northwood arguing loudly back in the classroom. I realized my knees were kind of shaky. Why am I upset? I wondered. It isn't my argument. No one has offered to take me to the Bahamas this February, I thought bitterly. Why should I care if Dennis gets a makeup test or not? "I'm late for my job," Margaret said, shifting her backpack over her red down jacket. Margaret waitresses at Alma's coffee shop for a few hours after school every day. "I just wanted to ask you if you wanted to come to dinner tonight." "I guess," I said, twirling the combination lock in my locker and pulling the door open. "My mom won't be home till after 9. Thanks, Margaret." "Later," she called, hurrying down the hall, her red hair bouncing as she ran. I bent down and started pulling books from my locker and stuffing them into my backpack. A few seconds later, I glanced up to see Dennis angrily stomping out of Mr. Northwood's room. He crossed the hall, shaking his head, muttering to himself. "I could kill that guy," he said breathlessly to me. "I really could." I laughed. I didn't know what else to do. My heart started pounding. I mean, Dennis's locker was 2 down from mine, but he had never said a word to me before. I stood up and tried to flash him an encouraging smile. I don't think he noticed. He slammed his fist into his locker door. The clang echoed down the hall. "Ow," I said. "Didn't that hurt?" "Yeah," Dennis replied. He grinned at me and shook his head. "It hurt a lot. Stupid, huh?" Well, I couldn't think of a good reply. My mouth had gone all dry. Dennis was just so good-looking. I guess I'd kind of had a crush on him for a long time, but I never really allowed myself to think about it. "I just hate that guy," Dennis grumbled, flexing his hand. "He isn't being very fair," I said. "He's a jerk," Dennis replied angrily. "A total jerk." His green eyes locked on my face. It was as though he were seeing me for the first time. "I could kill him. Really," Dennis repeated. He turned away from me and started fiddling with his combination lock. "You know how?" "How?" I asked a little too eagerly. "I don't know," Dennis said, scowling. "Well, let's see," I replied, thinking hard. "You could glue that little tape recorder to his ear and make him listen to all the classes he records. That would bore him to death," I snickered. Dennis didn't smile. "Not painful enough," he grumbled. He tugged at the locker door, but it wouldn't open. He let out a frustrated groan and started furiously twirling the lock again. Suddenly, he stopped and turned to me. "I'd like to stuff him into that briefcase he always carries," he said, "and lock it shut, and toss it in the trash." "He's too tall," I replied. "He wouldn't fit." "I'd fold him up," Dennis said. "That would be the fun part, folding him." "Yuck!" I made a disgusted face. "You're really sick." "No, just angry," Dennis sighed. "He's going to mess up my life. He really is." "Well, maybe you should just shoot him," I joked. "Not as much fun as folding him up first," Dennis replied. He wasn't smiling. I stared at him, trying to determine just how serious he was. I mean, I knew he couldn't really be serious about killing Mr. Northwood. "You could fold him up and then shoot him?" I suggested. Dennis's eyes lit up. I think Dennis likes me, I thought. He keeps staring at me, studying me with his eyes. "I could fold him up, shoot him, then drown him," Dennis exclaimed. "You could fold him up, shoot him, drown him, then hang him," I added, getting into the game. Dennis laughed. Hey, I made him laugh, I told myself. I suddenly wondered if my hair was messed up. I brushed a hand through it. You could fold him up, shoot him, drown him, then... I stopped when I saw Mr. Northwood standing in the classroom doorway, staring hard at us. Oh no, I thought, feeling my heart leap into my throat. How long has he been standing there? Has he heard everything? Chapter 4. Mr. Northwood glared at Dennis, then at me. I let out a choking sound. I was sure he had heard me. I could feel my face grow hot. I knew it must be bright red. But then, without saying a word, Mr. Northwood turned and headed away from us down the hall. I just stood there, watching his head and shoulders bob as he took his usual long strides. I didn't start breathing again until he disappeared around the corner. I have to be nice to him, I whispered to Dennis. He's my next-door neighbor, on Fear Street. Dennis's mouth dropped open. Huh? You live next door to Northwood? I nodded. Do you believe it? I see him all the time. He's always messing around in the backyard, even in winter. It's like having a spy from school next door. I always have the feeling he's checking up on me. I mean, I know he isn't, but still. I realized I was running on a bit at the mouth. I guess I was just so relieved that Mr. Northwood hadn't heard my diabolical plans to bump him off. And I liked being able to confide in Dennis. I'm usually really shy around boys. The old self-confidence problem, you know. But I suddenly had this feeling that I could talk to Dennis, that he and I were on the same wavelength. Northwood's neighbor. Weird, Dennis muttered, zipping his maroon and gray school jacket. Weird. He slammed his locker shut and swung his backpack onto his shoulder. Weird enough living on Fear Street, I muttered. Dennis snickered. You believe all those stories about ghosts and scary creatures on Fear Street? Mr. Northwood is the scariest creature I've seen there, I joked. We both laughed. We were walking side by side toward the parking lot exit. Our shoulders bumped a couple of times. I was feeling supercharged, really excited. Dennis is just a great guy, I thought. So great looking with that black hair over his broad forehead, and those eyes that could burn right into you like green fire. I have to admit, it felt really great walking down the hall with one of the most popular guys at Shadyside High. I suddenly wished the school were empty. I wanted the halls to be crowded with kids, so that everyone could see that Dennis and I were together. We stepped out of the building into the dark gray afternoon. The air was heavy and wet. Looks like snow, Dennis commented, his eyes on the low clouds. I'm glad Coach called off practice today. He headed along the walk to the student parking lot, and I followed. Maybe he'd like to go get a Coke with me, I thought. We could just walk to the corner. The corner is a small coffee shop a couple of blocks from school, where Shadyside kids hang out. A picture flashed into my mind. Dennis and me, sitting across from each other in a booth in the corner, holding hands over the table, staring dreamily into each other's eyes. What a picture. I took a deep breath and worked up my courage to ask him if he wanted to get a Coke. Dennis? I stopped when I saw where Dennis was headed. Right to the little red Miata, stopped with his engine running at the end of the walk. Caitlin's red Miata. I could see her behind the wheel. She smiled and waved at Dennis as we approached. Dennis turned to me at the end of the walk. Sorry, he said. I'd offer you a lift, but it's only a two-seater. He shrugged, then crossed to the passenger side to get in. That's okay, Dennis, I told him with a devilish smile. I'll make room. I pulled open the driver's door and grabbed Caitlin's arm with both hands. Get out, I ordered. Huh? Caitlin's dark eyes went wide in shock. What? Get out, I cried. I gripped her arm tight with one hand, then I raised my other hand to her dark brown hair. She screamed as I started to tug, but I was too strong for her. I jerked her out of the car, knocked her to the ground, and gave her a hard kick that sent her sprawling. Then I slid behind the wheel, slammed the door, and drove the car away with Dennis beside me. I glanced over at him to check out his reaction. He was staring back at me with amazement and admiration. Chapter 5. After that, Dennis realized he and I belonged together. He dumped Caitlin, and we lived happily ever after. Do you believe that? No way. Of course I didn't really pull Caitlin from the car. Of course that wild little scene was all in my skinny little head. What really happened was that I stood and watched as Dennis climbed into the car. Behind the wheel, Caitlin stared right through me, as if I weren't even there. Then she drove away with Dennis. Dennis didn't even look back. And I was left standing there, my imagination playing out all kinds of evil scenes. Why do I have such violent fantasies? Why am I always picturing myself socking people in the jaw, pushing people down stairs or off cliffs, tearing people's heads off and watching the blood gush up from their necks? Why do I always imagine myself doing the most horrible, unspeakable things? I guess it's because in real life, I'm such a total mouse. A week later, there was an empty seat in history class. Dennis had gone to the Bahamas with his family. Poor Dennis, I thought bitterly. He's missing the midterm exam tomorrow, and today he's missing a fascinating lecture on the separation of powers. I was sitting in the back row, next to Melody Dawson. She held a pocket mirror in one hand and was brushing her perfect blonde hair. I had sat next to Melody all year, and she had barely said 2 words to me. Every afternoon she would sit down, arrange her notebook on the desk, then brush her hair. What a snob. Melody was always spotless and perfect. She wore French designer jeans that had been dry cleaned. They had a perfect crease down the front, and almost all of her t-shirts and sweaters had the little Ralph Lauren polo pony on them. Once I saw her changing into white sweat socks for gym, and they had polo ponies on them. Designer sweat socks. Do you believe it? Melody has these perfect little lips, and a perfect little upturned nose, and perfect creamy white skin. The boys all think she's hot stuff. I think she's just a stuck-up snob. Anyway, we were sitting in the back row on another dreary gray afternoon. I was thinking about Dennis. He was probably on a beach in the sun, swimming in sparkling blue water. At the front of the room, Mr. Northwood clicked on his little tape recorder and set it on the corner of his desk. "Do you know why I record our classes?" he asked. "I listen to them again later, at home." He cleared his throat, his big Adam's apple bobbing under his gray turtleneck. "The tapes help me remember what we talked about," he continued in his thin, high voice. "I tape myself at home, too. It can be very instructional." Melody looked up from her mirror. "Why doesn't he get a life?" she said in a low voice. Several kids snickered. Mr. Northwood turned to Melody. "I heard that, Miss Dawson." Melody stared back defiantly at him. I would have turned bright red and shrunk back in my seat. I would have been totally mortified. But Melody just glared at him, almost challenging him. "Melody, I'd like you to come see me after school," Mr. Northwood said sternly, scratching a craggy cheek. "You and I need to have a little talk." "I can't," Melody replied coldly. Mr. Northwood turned his watery blue eyes on her. "What did you say?" "I can't," Melody repeated. "I have a tennis lesson." The teacher tapped his long, bony fingers on the desktop. "I'm afraid you'll be late for your tennis lesson today," he said quietly. "I'm afraid I won't," I heard Melody mutter to herself. Sure enough, as soon as class ended, Melody jumped up and ran out the door, hurrying to her tennis lesson. Wow, I thought, that really takes nerve. If Mr. Northwood had told me to stay after school, I'd obediently stay, no matter what I was missing. I'd be too afraid not to show up. But Melody ran out without a second thought. I didn't like Melody. I'd never liked her, actually. But I found myself wishing I had the nerve that she had. I stood up and started gathering my books. Some kids were heading out the door to their lockers. I saw Zach Hamilton and Caitlin talking by the chalkboard. Then I caught the angry expression on Mr. Northwood's face. "I don't care how many banks her father runs," he was fuming. "She's just like everybody else in my class." I saw Zach and Caitlin both laugh. Mr. Northwood spun around to face them. "What are you two giggling about?" he demanded angrily. "Perhaps you'd like to stay an extra hour and discuss it with me." After dinner that night, a peanut butter sandwich and a small bag of potato chips, I was sitting cross-legged on the floor of my room, leaning against the bed, talking to Margaret on the phone. My homework was spread out on my desk, but I just didn't feel like dealing with it. I was feeling a little weird, a little jumpy. Sometimes living in an old house on Fear Street creeps me out when I'm all alone at night. Outside the bedroom window, a light snow was falling. The wind gusted and swirled, making the old window rattle. Every once in a while, I could feel a cold burst of air on the back of my neck. "I keep thinking about Dennis Arthur," I told Margaret. "You know, down in the Bahamas, swimming and snorkeling and everything while we freeze." "Yeah," Margaret replied, sighing. "Let's face it, Joanna, we have boring lives. I mean, the most exciting thing that happens to me is when somebody leaves a whole dollar tip at the restaurant." "I should be working on my report," I murmured, yawning. "Wow, Mr. Northwood is sure losing it these days," Margaret remarked. He's been on everybody's case." "Not everybody's," I corrected her. "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "Well, haven't you noticed how he picks only on Dennis and his friends? You know, the rich kids, Caitlin and Melody, the group that was at the 7-Eleven that night last week." Margaret was silent for a moment. I guess she was thinking about what I said. "Well," she piped up finally, "if he's picking only on the rich kids, I guess you and I have got it made." I snickered. "Yeah, I guess we're going to ace the course." "Why do you think Northwood is on their case?" Margaret demanded. I started to reply, but stopped. I heard the slam of a car door. Then I heard a crash downstairs. Broken glass? A broken window? Margaret, I've got to go, I cried. I think somebody is trying to break in.